to align investment and policies with sustainable development. Yet, despite progress, we must face facts. Many commitments remain unfulfilled. Meanwhile, the world is facing seismic shocks that make financing challenges harder to solve. On the other hand, geopolitical divisions undermine collective action. Faced with sky-high debt burdens and cost of capital, developing countries have limited prospects of financing the Sustainable Development Goals. The Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development provides a unique opportunity to tackle these challenges head-on. It opens the door for world leaders to adopt ambitious reforms to deliver affordable, long-term financing at scale and deliver the SDG stimulus. And it presents a unique
of the United Nations Commission for Africa, my good friend Under-Secretary General Liu Juan, honorable ministers, distinguished co-chairs and participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct honor and privilege to welcome you all to Addis Ababa to participate in the first preparatory session of the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. After successfully hosting the Third International Conference on Financing for Development in 2015, Ethiopia is honored to host this first prep session. I thank the co-facilitators for their leadership, as well as UNDESA and UNECA for collaborating with Ethiopia in preparing this meeting. When the Addis Ababa Action Agenda was adopted as a means of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, it raised enormous expectation and enthusiasm. Regrettably, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda is not being fully implemented as anticipated. We convene today to take stock of its achievements and gaps, to revitalize our commitment and find innovative ways to implement the pledge we made a decade ago. It is therefore pertinent and timely to chart out a more pragmatic and ambitious approach in view of the multiple challenges we face globally. Excellencies, poverty and hunger are on the rise. Geopolitical tensions are threatening global peace and security, consequently so undermining multilateralism. The COVID-19 pandemic has aggravated the debt crisis in most developing countries and has led to a decline in government revenues. The extreme impacts of climate change are eroding development gains in the most vulnerable countries. Many developing countries lack financial resources to effectively respond and mitigate the effects of climate change. Existing financial mechanisms such as development aid and climate funds are inadequate, fragmented, unresponsive to the special needs of developing countries. In evaluating the reasons for failure to deliver on the promise of the Sustainable Development Agenda, it is fitting to mention the words of the UN Secretary General, who warned us that without massive investment, our vision of creating a world free of poverty would remain elusive. This conference, therefore, provides an opportunity for global reflection towards rescuing the 2030 Agenda by advocating for the full implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Excellencies, as we commence the preparation for the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development in Spain next year, it is incumbent upon us to identify the gaps in the implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. This process should lead to the adoption of a transformative and ambitious financial framework to achieve the SDGs as we promised and agreed in 2015. In our view, the outcome in Spain should be anchored on 5 major points. First, we must recognize that there are sufficient financial resources globally to meet the 2030 Agenda. What is lacking is political will and commitment to deliver the necessary funds. The international community should thus galvanize the collective will to channel and deliver this much-needed funds. Second, the global financial architecture must be reformed to be more inclusive and equitable. Developed countries should advocate for and support reforms in international financial institutions to ensure that their policies better address the needs of developing countries. Third, we must revamp efforts to combat illicit financial flows, and we should also support endeavors to enhance international tax cooperation. Fourth, developed countries should enhance their contribution to climate finance, including by operationalizing the loss and damage funding mechanism. These financial resources should be directed towards building resilient infrastructure, enhancing social protection system, and supporting agriculture and energy development projects to address both immediate needs and long-term development goals. Fifth, debt relief initiatives should be scaled up both at multilateral and bilateral frameworks to solve unsustainable debt burden and unlock investment to SDG-related projects. In this regard, we expect concrete commitment from lending countries and institutions. In Ethiopia, we allocate more than 60% of the annual budget to SDGs, consistent with our position of maximizing domestic resource mobilization. We're implementing national flag projects in energy, social protection, tourism, digital technologies, and urban development sectors. Ethiopia is also implementing a Green Legacy initiative pioneered by His Excellency Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, in which close to 40 billion seedlings are planted to curb the impacts of climate change, promote food security, and create jobs. Such national development initiatives should be supported by enabling international financial frameworks. While Ethiopia stands ready to share its experience, the global financial institutions and developed countries should provide concrete support to such national efforts. Finally, let me take this opportunity to invite all of you to visit some of the sites in Addis Ababa that demonstrates how local innovative financing initiatives have enabled us to realize successful projects in Ethiopia. Welcome again. Thank you.
Je remercie Son Excellence, Monsieur le ministre des Affaires étrangères de l'Éthiopie. Je donne maintenant la parole au ministre des Finances de l'Éthiopie, Son Excellence, Monsieur Ahmed Shide.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the outset, please allow me to begin by extending my heartfelt appreciation to the Ethiopian government for hosting this first substantive session of the Preparatory Committee for the Fourth International Conference on Financing for Development. Almost a decade after the world leaders agreed to Addis Ababa action agenda, our pursuit of a new global financing framework must start with a stake of what we have achieved since 2015. It is therefore fitting that we begin our discussion here in Ethiopia, in Addis again. Excellencies, our assessment is a sober one. Amidst a global sustainable development crisis, the 2024 Financing for Sustainable Development report, published earlier this year, found the financing gaps are large and growing. The financing divide between the developed and the developing countries has not been bridged. Developing countries are faced with a high debt burden and the high cost of the capital. Concessional financing falls short of the commitment and need. Billions of dollars are still lost annually from the tax avoidance and evasion. At the same time, fossil fuel subsidies remain in trading. We find ourselves at the crossroads. If we don't change course on financing, the 2030 targets will not be met. FFD4 is perhaps our last chance to transform the financing and deliver on the promises of the 2030 agenda in all the countries and for all people. Excellencies, dear colleagues, let me say a few words on how we could deliver on this promise and the steps we needed to take down to the road to the Spain next summer. This first substantive session of the Preparatory Committee for FFD4 provides the opportunity to take stock of the progress made so far, to learn lessons from both successes and failures, and to identify the gaps we still have in implementation of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. One outcome of this stocktake could be a to-do list. We can outline those areas where we need to deepen our analysis and our dialogues. This will identify solutions that are ambitious enough to meet the challenges we face, and also that help to reach the political consensus. There will be several opportunities in the last quarter of the year where these substantive exchanges can take place. We will have an intersessional multi-stakeholder hearing at the end of October, where we look forward to hearing a wide range of the perspectives from civil society, academics, and other non-stakeholders. The second session of the Preparatory Committee in December 2024 will be another opportunity to discuss the substantive elements of the FFD4. Excellencies, dear colleagues, as we proceed with the preparatory process, please rest assured that my department, UNDESA, is committed to supporting a substantive and inclusive preparatory process with a broad participation from all member states and all relevant stakeholders, including by civil society, other experts and academics, and the private sector. We look forward to working with all of you to deliver a stronger outcome that can accelerate the implementation of the SDGs and the climate objectives, and also to address the needs of all countries. I thank you.
For organizing this conference and for the warm hospitality. I hope that the good spirit of Addis can guide us again in this session. I now invite the Preparatory Committee to begin its consideration of Agenda Item 3, entitled Adoption of the Agenda and Other Organizational Matters. Delegations would recall that the Preparatory Committee adopted its agenda as contained in document A/conf.227/2024/PC/1 at its organizational session on 23rd February 2024. I invite the committee to now turn its attention to the proposed organization of work of the first session, which was circulated to all delegations as document A/227/2024/PC/CRP.1/Rev1. Are there any comments on the proposed organization of work? I see none. May I take that the Preparatory Committee approves the proposed organization of work for its first session as contained in the document, on the understanding that further adjustments will be made as warranted during the course of session. I hear no objection. It is so decided. I now invite the Preparatory Committee to turn to draft decision A/227/2024/PC/L3, entitled Dates of the Intersessional Multi-Stakeholder Hearing at the second session of the Preparatory Committee, which we have submitted in our capacity as co-chairs. Is there any comment on the draft decision? I see none. May I take that the Preparatory Committee wishes to adopt the referred document? I hear no objection. It is so decided. Are there any comments after the adoption of the decision? I see none. Thank you. I now invite the preparatory committee to begin its consideration of sub-item A of agenda item 4, preparations for the conference, organizational and procedural preparations, to consider draft decision A/conf.227/2024/PC/L2, entitled Provisional Agenda of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, which we have submitted in our capacity as co-chairs. Before proceeding to the consideration of document L2, I should like to make the following oral revision, which is editorial in nature. Under item 10 of the provisional agenda contained in the annex before the word outcome document, add the words adoption of the and delete the letter S in the brackets at the end of the word document. Item 10 would read, adoption of the outcome document of the conference. Are there any comments on the draft decision orally revised? I see none. So may I take that the preparatory committee wishes to adopt the draft decision as revised? I hear no objection. It is so decided. Are there any comments after the adoption of the decision? I see none, so this concludes the opening segment. The preparatory committee will begin its ministerial scene setter after a brief pause to allow the podium to be rearranged. Please remain seated. Thank you very much. The implementation of the SDGs. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this discussion. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would like first to invite Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to deliver a keynote speaker statement. And I thank you, Madam Deputy Secretary General, for being with us and for your tireless efforts in this dossier. Thank you very much.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, I extend my heartfelt appreciation to the Ethiopian government convening this first session of the Preparatory Committee for the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. I would also like to deeply appreciate and commend the Department for Economic and Social Affairs, Mr. Li Zhonghua, and his team for the preparation and the support of the Economic Commission for Africa. Beginning this process in Addis Ababa holds profound significance, a city whose name has become synonymous with financing for development following the agreement of the 2015 Action Agenda. The Addis Agenda, alongside the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, also agreed in 2015, provided humanity with a three-dimensional roadmap towards a more just, a more equitable, and a more sustainable world. I'd like to thank the Minister of Finance for Ethiopia for his steer this morning as he brought a reality check to the asks of Africa. 9 years later, there is an urgent need for a course correction. And might I just say that the first course correction would be to see many more women at the opening of such an important event defining the agenda. Only 17% of the SDG targets are on track. Core commitments to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger are in peril, as development has effectively stalled. Climate action falls woefully short, and the surge in renewable energy is bypassing most developing countries, which face high costs of capital. Behind these disappointing outcomes is a deeply troubling financial context. Many developing countries cannot invest in their future as they struggle to meet their immediate needs, paying salaries and meeting debt service. International capital is flowing out of developing economies rather than in. The economic outlook for developing countries remains bleak. And while the global economy has been described as resilience, there is a soft landing in the north, but there is a crash landing in the south. The need for reform was evident in 2015 and found its reflections in the Addis Agenda. But the series of shocks that have rocked the world since 2020 underline the urgency of delivering on the Addis commitments and demand even bolder steps to create an international financial architecture that can overcome today's finance divide. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this week's meeting served to take stock of our progress since adopting the Addis Agenda. Despite the challenges we face, significant strides have been made since 2015. International tax cooperation has been strengthened. There has been a surge of interest in sustainable investing, and development cooperation is far larger in volume than ever before. But this is far from enough. If we are to rescue the SDGs, we need much greater urgency and much higher ambition. At the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development next June in Spain, we have a unique opportunity to deliver on just that. This week, we must begin by laying the groundwork for its future success. Excellencies, allow me to share 6 areas for action. First, we must tackle the unfolding debt and development crisis. This includes improving debt resolution when defaults occur. But it is more than that. We must find ways to lower the cost of borrowing. Too many countries spend more on debt servicing than on health, education, and other critical investments. As long as dozens of countries have no fiscal space to invest in the SDGs, our global goals cannot be reached. People, especially women and youth, are being left behind, and the 1.5-degree world that we need is hanging by a thread. Africa, least responsible is bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. The Financing for Development 4 must deliver a package of reforms to create fiscal space for countries suffering from debt overhangs and to resolve crises and provide a clean slate for those that are insolvent. Second, we must enhance access to long-term, affordable financing to enable bold investments across key transitions. The MDBs and other development banks are a powerful tool to reduce the cost of borrowing, to manage risk, and to leverage private capital. Let's use them to maximum capacity. Let's commit to strengthening their capital, help them to optimize their balance sheets, and give them additional tools, such as through the SDR rechanneling, that would deliver more and better financing. Third, we must close gaps in the global financial safety net so that all countries are protected in time of crises. SDRs could be a more effective tool if they are issued more swiftly and to those who need them most. Fourth, establishing a fair and effective international tax system is vital to allow countries to mobilize more resources domestically and to combat illicit financial flows. I'm encouraged by progress that we have been making in this area, not least in negotiations on terms of reference for a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. This would not have been possible without African leadership. Fifth, to achieve the SDGs, we must also harness the trillions of dollars in the international capital markets. This was a great expectation around the Addis conference, with promises and a step change for mobilizing billions to trillions, but this has not been delivered. Meanwhile, the SDG financing gap has grown and is now estimated at $4 trillion. Next year's conference is an opportunity to rethink how we mobilize far greater volumes of international capital, including through blending with public resources and the focus on SDG impact. MDBs must provide the guarantees and the better bank needed for the scale and ambition. Sixth and finally, we must answer calls for global economic governance reform and make the international financial architecture more inclusive and just. This is the only way to rebuild trust in the multilateral system and prevent further fragmentation. Excellencies, we stand at a crossroads yet again. We have a unique opportunity to forge a more effective and equitable global financial system and to unlock financing at scale for those that need it most. This is about investments in people and investments in the planet. We cannot afford to miss it. Let this meeting inject energy, ideas, scale of financing and urgency into the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. And together, let us shape a more prosperous, sustainable, and inclusive future that leaves no one behind. I thank you.
Thank you so much. We also recognize Mr. Lee. We are worried that the technology would hamper your plane coming from New York, but we are glad that you are here finally. Thank you so much. And of course, our the co-chairs, or yourself from Portugal, and our colleague from Burundi. Thank you so much. I also acknowledge Mr. Mnangagwa, who is here. Zimbabwe is the chair of the Conference of Ministers of Finance, Planning and Development, and he's there the chair for this year. And we thank them very much for really being the chair and for helping us on the African continent. Now, before we come to the panelists, let me just say a few things. First of all, we are meeting at a time we are having the most serious challenges we have ever had. And I'll just try to summarize them. It's just repeating what other people have said. But I think one complicated one is the issue of global conflict. We have never seen such a conflict for a long time of this scale, which are global in nature. In Europe, finding the Haiti, you'll find them as far as the Middle East, and also on the African continent, almost in every part of the continent. This is hampering really any progress that we are making and having a toll on the people. We are also having the issue, what I call the elephant in the room, the debt. And the debt has been talked about this morning for a long time. This debt is so serious that it is now exceeding 1.1 trillion. And African countries together are paying 163 billion US dollars just to service the debt. And this one has a huge cost on the countries that we are talking about. For example, it was 31% of GDP in terms of debt in 2010. Last year, it came to 66% and is still growing. And we could see that it has increased from 2010 to 2022. It increased by 183%. In other words, the countries are highly indebted, and there is no room for spending on other areas that would improve the SDGs that we talk about. And there is also no solution. There is no longer the Paris Club. We have now the common framework, which is not addressing all the issues. We have the private lenders. We have non-Paris Club lenders. We also have Paris Club lenders. And there's a lot of issues that are in the current arrangement that we have with the common framework. We have the issue of financing. The gap that many people keep talking about, it's within between 4 trillion to 5 trillion in terms of really financing the SDGs. And that's why the reform of the international financial architecture is so important. But at the same time, for African countries, it is becoming even more serious that they don't have alternative in terms of borrowing. If you borrow domestically, you crowd out the private sector. And also, if you go internationally, the cost is very huge because we only have 2 investment-grade countries, Mauritius and Botswana. And also we have 21 countries which are not rated at all. So this becomes a very, very serious issue. The third one is climate. Climate is costing African governments by about 5% of GDP. Actually, last year in Mozambique, it cost 15% because of the cyclone. There are innovations that are in place, the green, the blue, and sustainability-linked bonds, the carbon credit, the renewable energy, but it's not enough, far from being enough. And all the investment that have happened, for example, in renewable energy, of 10 trillion between 2015 to 2022, Africa only received 2%, only 2%. And as recommended in the last FFD, the domestic resource mobilization has not improved at all. There is still a lot of work to do in terms of dealing with the issue of domestic resource mobilization. And now we are having the International Tax Cooperation, which is really a lot of work to do in terms of addressing these kind of issues. But beyond that, we've had, since the last FFD here in Addis Ababa in 2015, we have also had some pandemics. We had Ebola in a big part of our continent, and we had COVID-19, which is global in nature. All these issues have been costing development in one way or the other. And here we have a team that is going to help us really understand what we need to do. Here we have Ahmed Shidi, Minister of Finance, of Ethiopia. And let me start with you, and maybe I can go one by one as I introduce. And by the way, you also need to introduce yourselves afterwards, because I don't want to make a diplomatic instance. We sent you some questions that were very clear. The key lessons from past FFD conferences and lessons learned. Also, addressing the implementation lags and reviewing commitments. Steps to mark the change in financing for sustainable development, ensuring an ambitious and successful FFD outcome, action-oriented and ambitious proposals for FFD. Let me start with the Minister. In addition to that, I want you to ask you two additional questions. I know that you are there in 2015 as a Minister of State. So now being a minister, that shows you are smart, and that means that you really, now you have to give us a solution given that you have gone through the whole entire process. Now, what strategies has Ethiopia implemented to improve domestic resource mobilization, and what lessons can be shared with others? Secondly, how is Ethiopia addressing the debt sustainability challenges, and what support is needed from international financial institutions? Please go ahead.
Thank you, our moderator, Mr. Clever Gateti, Amina Mohammed, our sister, Deputy Secretary of United Nations and the Chair of United Nations Sustainable Development Group, Honorable Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I was a state minister 9 years ago, facilitating the big conference with a lot of optimism and the future looking very bright in terms of financing for development. But the result is, as well articulated by the Secretary General, the vision was not met. We need to do more. It is an honor to address you today on the crucial topic of assessing the implementation of Addis Ababa Action Agenda within the framework of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Our discussion serves as both a reflection on the past effort and a clarion call to action to ensure the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. As we approach the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, it is imperative to review our progress and identify gaps. 9 years ago, the global community convened in Addis Ababa to adopt the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, a bold framework designed to mobilize financial resources for sustainable development and SDGs. Despite notable advancement in several areas, our journey has been arduous, and the full potential of Addis Ababa Action Agenda remains largely untapped. Today, I will highlight Ethiopia's achievement, outline our key challenges, and propose actions to accelerate our path forward. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia has made significant strides implementing the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and advancing toward its Sustainable Development Goals. We have notably enhanced financial inclusion, expanding access to financial services across our population. Since 2015, the number of banks and branches has grown substantially, underpinned by a regulatory framework supporting digital financial services, which have spurred innovation and competition. Mobile banking users have soared from 4.9 million in 2019 to 27.9 million in 2023. Despite these gains, challenges persist, particularly in rural areas without underdeveloped financial infrastructure and barriers like high cost and limited awareness of financial products, hindering access for low-income groups. Furthermore, Ethiopia has bolstered domestic resource mobilization through tax reforms and improved administration, resulting in a 24.8% average increase in revenue over the past 3 years. Despite these gains, challenges such as tax avoidance, and a large informal sector continue to affect revenue mobilization and collection, contributing to persistently low tax to GDP ratio. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia has continued to increasingly invest on pro-poor sectors and social protection programs such as health, education, and water. As a result of the growing investment, access to primary healthcare services, as well as enrollment in primary school, has increased significantly. However, the challenge of debt servicing and the fluctuations in ODA has undermined the sustainability of spending on pro-poor sectors. The share of ODA declined to a 1% of GDP in 2023 from 3.2% in 2020. Addressing this financial pressure is critical. This includes supporting the government in enhancing debt sustainability and scaling up development financing. Our commitment to renewable energy has led to significant investment in hydro, wind, and solar energy projects. These initiatives are part of our broader climate action strategy, contributing to both sustainable development and the fight against climate change. The government has implemented policies to attract investment in renewable energy, including the National Electrification Program. Securing adequate financing for large-scale renewable energy projects remains a challenge. We have also put effort to promote the use of electric vehicles through various policies and initiatives, including tax incentives. Ethiopia has continued its commitment to building a carbon-neutral and climate-resilient economy. During the past couple of years, we have restored millions of hectares of degraded landscapes, including through the Green Legacy Program, a national big program championed by the Prime Minister with multi-million population of Ethiopia participating every time. We have managed to increase our national forest cover to 23.6% in 2024 from 14.7% in 2014. Realizing our nationally determined contribution NDC target requires over USD 316 billion over the next 6 years. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, despite our achievement, developing countries like Ethiopia continue to face significant financing gaps, exacerbated by recent global crises such as COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical conflict, and economic instability. The escalating debt burden is particularly concerning, with many nations allocating more resources to debt servicing than to essential services like health and education, hindering sustainable development investment. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda has underscored the need for a comprehensive and inclusive approach to financing development to address these challenges and accelerate SDG implementation. Bold and coordinated actions are imperative. We must advocate for comprehensive reform of the international financial architecture, including improving global economic governance, enhancing debt relief measures, and reducing the cost of sovereign borrowing. Mobilizing private investment and strengthening multilateral development bank are also critical steps. Innovative financing mechanisms such as debt for climate swaps, carbon trading, and green bonds should be promoted, and leveraging technology for sustainable development. The SDG stimulus proposed by United Nations Secretary General, which calls for scaling up development financing, is pivotal. This includes increasing liquidity support to countries in need and significantly expanding affordable long-term financing for SDGs. Harnessing technological advancement and digitalization will further enhance development financing. Implementation of policies that promote sustainable and inclusive development, such as harmonizing responsible financing standards and advancing gender equality, is essential. Ensuring all financial flows align with SDGs will be crucial in achieving our collective development objectives. Regarding domestic resource mobilization, Ethiopia has designed a homegrown economic reform agenda, and on this agenda, macroeconomic reform, structural reform, and sectoral reform is part of the major policy issue, so that we'll have a stable price and sustainable balance of payment position, as well as sustaining growth. So this depends more on significantly domestic resource mobilization. So the reform includes pivotal changes in tax policy, as well as improvement in the efficiency of public investment to reverse the declining tax to GDP ratio and utilize the country's potential tax capacity up to 20% of GDP. In parallel, significant tax administration reforms, including the enhancing information technology capabilities, moving to e-filing and e-payment systems, and strengthening tax audit and tax education will be top priority. So we are working both on tax policy, introducing new tax, as well as improving existing tax, and also on tax administration reform is critical, particularly as now moving forward in a significant deepening of our macroeconomic reform agenda. Domestic resource mobilization is going to be the cornerstone of our reform. That's why the Prime Minister has initiated an interministerial tax group that will significantly oversee the enhanced tax collection, both in terms of tax policy implementation, as well as also enhancing the capacity of our revenue ministry, as well as our custom commission, so that compliance on tax will be enhanced, so that we can reverse declining tax to GDP ratio. The Ethiopian Security Exchange is also significantly going to help us to mobilize resources for investment, and this securities exchange will be in the process of being established, and it's going to start soon. Public-private partnerships is another way to mobilize resources for investment, and we are working with the National Bank of Ethiopia in terms of facilitating reforms that will attract PPP projects into various energy and other businesses. So we have also innovative financing mechanisms where extra budgetary resource mobilization is being used in terms of also developing significant asset on tourism development, on urban renewal, on urban greening, on corridor development, which has significantly enhancing the development results in the country. In terms of debt sustainability, the Ministry of Finance has adopted a strict adherence to medium-term debt management strategy. We are keen to finalize the debt treatment under G20 Common Framework. Ethiopia has just recently been given financial assurances from our creditor committee as part of G20 Common Framework. I agree that this process took longer, lengthy process, and it's not sufficient. We need to do more. But Ethiopia is on the verge of getting that arrangement as well, and as part of our deepening of reform agenda, we will continue on that issue. So addressing the foreign exchange imbalance, implementation of domestic resource mobilization agenda is part of our ongoing homegrown economic reform agenda 2, where sustaining growth, stable price in the economy, as well as balance of payment sustainability is a major agenda towards enhancing the employment in the economy. Therefore, one cornerstone of this is domestic resource mobilization, and debt sustainability are two very important pillars from fiscal perspective. So we need international support, global reform, and global discussions. Global voice has to be articulated towards the issue of addressing debt. That is also very important because most of countries in Africa has major problem in this area. And without addressing debt sustainability, domestic resource mobilization will not be enough by itself because those resources which are mobilized has to be used for development purposes. If debt risk is very high, how can we transform resources into development outcomes, into development services? Therefore, these types of discussions is very important. Ethiopia is the best example where, despite multiple challenges, we have been able to achieve a strong growth, double than most sub-Saharan African average. This has happened because we have been able to also mobilize domestic resources, as well as improve the quality of our spending, which is pro-poor, and also improving the efficiency of public-owned enterprises. We are also working on innovative financing like capital exchange market as well. Thank you very much.
It's played in Spain, but the players are the member states of the United Nations. We may be referees, perhaps. So I think what we've seen today is that, and reading all the documents that have been prepared for this first preparatory committee, is that there is a broad consensus on the fact that there are 5 elements, I think, on which we have to base our action. First of all, I would like to say that we meet here 9 years after the adoption of the Addis Ababa Agenda, and almost next year will be 10 years since the adoption of the agenda. And frankly, we are late. And the panorama is not very heartening, let's say. We are running out of time in meeting the SDGs. There has been some achievements which are out of the question, and there are hundreds of millions of people who've been lifted out of poverty. But there are other areas where we are lagging behind significantly, and there are other areas, and other speakers have mentioned this, on the where there's been even, because of the situation with COVID, geopolitical tensions, other factors, where we have even moved backwards. So the situation is not altogether positive. And all this, evolution is not necessarily caused all by the lack of financing, but lack of finances lies at the heart of everything we are speaking about. So the financing gap is 4 billion euros, as the Deputy Secretary General mentioned in her speech, and so we need to make a push forward, and a significant push forward, and we will try to do that. But of course, we have to try to bring every country together and reach a consensus. But I think what we see today is that there are 5 pillars on financing, because the needs are so huge that we need to avail ourselves of all of them. And the first, of course, is the action of multilateral development banks. We need to multiply their loan capabilities, and we have to adapt their loan granting schemes to the needs of developing countries. And of course, as my neighbor just said, we have to increase the concessional part of those loans. All this without weakening, of course, their financial integrity, which is what makes them useful. Spain, in this sense, has reached an agreement with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to channel 1.5 billion special drawing rights to the Resilience Fund, which means we are doubling our contribution to that fund. We also need to find ways to focus in reducing the burden of sovereign debt, reinforcing a dialogue, but this dialogue between creditors and debtors has to be based on the SDGs that we all agreed. So this has to be the basis for the dialogue. Then, of course, private investment fluxes are fundamental. We have to take measures that promote investment in developing countries. And I would say that perhaps the most important obstacle to this is the perception of risk for these investments. So we need to improve and update our insurance system and our protection of investment, both at the bilateral level and multilateral. But there also needs to be an effort in countries who want to receive investment in improving their legal framework and their regulations. So in face of all these challenges, of course, mobilizing internal resources is crucial, and all this has to play together. And so we need to improve fiscal collection, and if there's a need for technical formation for any countries, we at the UN level or both at bilateral level, there needs to be technical support. We need to invest in health, education, and infrastructure. That's what makes development possible. And we need to also think of redistribution, because inequality is is a factor which hampers development very significantly. So, and finally, and last but not least, may I say, we have to significantly increase AOD, improve and increase. We have done our part in Spain. We just put the 0.7 GDP percentage of GDP as in our development law, but we must, and this will develop along this in the next few years. But we must not forget that AOD right now makes up only $200 billion, so just 5% of the international deficit on financing. So this is just again to stress that we need to bring all these 5 pillars together. And I think there are some horizontal aspects that are crucial. First, and I've been traveling through several countries, and something that comes up is electricity, power. This is absolutely crucial. What we see with development when it started industrial revolution is energy. Development is linked to energy, so we need to make sure that there's a reliable supply, without which economic growth is impossible. Another one is climate change. And I would like to say we are in Africa now, which is a continent which is responsible for only 4% of global emissions, but which suffers 1% loss of GDP growth, or even a bit more, each year because of climate change. So this is to stress that the climate transition has to be fair if it's going to be effective. And lastly, there's a human group which suffers systematic discrimination. So if we improve their situation in a significant way, this will be a qualitative step in improving development. And it's also the largest human group on earth, and I'm speaking, of course, about women and girls, and this has to be among our priorities as well. So anyway, the scene, this is a scene setter, so the scene is mixed, but we must not be pessimistic. I would like to stress again that we've lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. And we can certainly do it in the coming decades if we master the political will. So Spain is convinced that the only answer can only come from a reinforced multilateralism with a central role for the United Nations, where all states in the world are on an equal footing. If we are able to move forward, the fourth conference will be key to restoring trust in the multilateral system. And that's why Spain has postulated to become the host country, and we thank all member states for their trust. We will act as hosts with a view to inclusivity and building bridges between different positions. We will be an honest broker, but with a sense of ethical and political urgency. Because we know the recipes, and many speakers have brought them up. I've mentioned some of them. So what we need to find is the political will to apply them, because the cost of inaction is just too high. Thank you.
You had asked. Just to add one more question. We know that you have been doing quite a lot in terms of gender. What specific actions is your country advocating to ensure that gender equality is mainstreamed throughout the whole financing for development agenda?
Thank you, Chair. Indeed, it's great to be back in Addis to talk about these key questions for the continent and indeed the whole world. As you mentioned, Chair, Norway is a long-standing supporter of the Financing for Development agenda, and I'm honored to be here with distinguished participants in the room as well as the distinguished panel to discuss how we can push this agenda forward. And I'd like to thank those who have spoken before us to set the scene so well. We've heard about progress, but we've also heard about challenges and the complicated geopolitical, financial, climate context that we are having this discussion in. We've also heard speakers talk about how to move forward. I'm going to take us back a little bit, because we were honored as Norway to facilitate, together with Guyana, the negotiations of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda back in 2015. Since then, we have, as Norway, taken an active role in its follow-up and implementation. And we're very happy now and humbled to have been given or been trusted with the task to co-facilitate the outcome document for the fourth conference, together with Mexico, Nepal, and Zambia, and hosted by Spain. So thank you. We look forward to having important discussions in Sevilla next year. And this meeting here enables us to take stock and set the course for that very, very important meeting. And I thought I would just focus on what we thought were some of the added value of the agenda that we adopted here in Addis in 2015, to bring that with us as we move forward. Now, we heard in the one of the first speakers said that 2015 was a good year for multilateralism. Indeed, the SDGs, as well as adopting the Addis Agenda, the financing framework for the SDGs, and one of the added values of the Addis Agenda was its comprehensiveness, that it set out to leverage resources from all sources, from a wide range of stakeholders. And let me just point out three, I think I have three in my list. Let's see where we end up. 3 main points from Addis, and I think are very important as we move forward in that complicated context that we are in. And they are multi-stakeholder partnerships, they are domestic resource mobilization, and indeed gender equality that you asked me to mention specifically. But I would like to just really emphasize, as moving forward, the value that we focused and underlined so strongly in Addis of multi-stakeholder partnerships. The Addis Agenda recognized that strengthened partnerships are needed at the national, regional, and global level, involving multilateral organizations, such as those represented here, but also the private sector, involving civil society and involving academia. And the interagency task force that I think many in this room will be familiar with is a child of Addis. And the task force's task of following up the Addis Agenda is of immense value to us as member states and other stakeholders. And importantly, the task force facilitates direct collaboration between the multilateral organizations. So just mention that as something that was established in 2015 and that we need to bring with us as we move forward. My second point is around domestic resource mobilization. It was put firmly on the agenda in 2015. We've heard speakers now talk and provide impressive examples of how domestic resource mobilization is developing and improving. In 2015, member states agreed to promote efficient and transparent tax systems and to enhance cooperations to combat tax evasion and tackle illicit financial flows. In 2015, we launched the Addis Tax Initiative with commitments from development partners to double support for domestic resource mobilization. The Tax Inspectors Without Borders Initiative, a cooperation between the United Nations and OECD that has mobilized more than $2 billion in additional tax revenues, mainly here on the continent. And in 2016, the Platform for Collaboration on Tax was established to coordinate efforts between the UN, IMF, World Bank Group, as well as the OECD. And we heard also about the important negotiations that are happening as we are sitting here on the UN Framework Convention on Tax. And these will be very important for us as we move forward and talk about financing for development. On the part of Norway, we achieved the goal of doubling tax-related development assistance compared with the 2015 level by 2019, and we have maintained a high level of support since. We are quite good with taxation at home, and we are very happy to share those experiences with others that would like to learn from that experience. And that support and sharing of experience is channeled through civil society, to journalists, to multilateral organizations, research partners, and bilateral cooperation under our Tax for Development program. So let me then, Chair, get to the third point on gender equality. We did a study just over 10 years ago to look at the main source of Norway's wealth. You mentioned the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Of course, it helps to have oil. But the main source of Norway's prosperity is gender equality, involving women in the workforce. And bringing those lessons into the discussions was something that was high on Norway's agenda in 2015, and it will be high on Norway's agenda as we move forward. There are some specific issues that we can put on the agenda just to make sure, for example, of women's equal rights in decision-making and removing barriers to women's full economic participation. So moving forward, it will be important for us to promote equal access to resources, property, credit, and technology, regardless of gender. We could look to the private sector as well and encourage the private sector to promote gender equality by ensuring women's full employment, decent work, and equal pay. We believe that ensuring equal opportunities for both men and women is not only the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. And let me end, Chair, by making one more point about, we've talked about how we raise the funding through domestic resource mobilization, but it's also important how the funding is spent. We've heard about the challenges of debt, and we agree that we have to have this on the agenda as we move forward. I think we should also be ambitious and agree to mobilize those resources, addressing, again, how it is spent, debt as a challenge, but I would also like to mention another word, which is corruption, which is a major obstacle to development financing, not limited to any region of the world. We know that corruption in public procurement, for example, drains funds from essential services and distorts the business environment, inhibiting investment and skewing trade. So that's another topic that we believe should be integral to the development financing agenda. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful points, and especially for